With 40,000 Muslim warriors facing an enemy force of at least 200,000, the stakes could not have been higher. The year was 636 CE, and the location was the strategic plain of Yarmouk, a land where the rivers met and the empires clashed. The fate of Syria, the heart of the Roman-Byzantine Empire, hung in the balance. As al-Tabari recorded in his Tarikh al-Rusul wa al-Muluk, the Muslims, under the leadership of Khalid ibn al-Walīd, found themselves at a critical juncture. The Byzantine forces, bolstered by their allies, were determined to halt the Muslim advance. The question on every Muslim's mind was clear. How could they possibly prevail against such overwhelming odds? The Muslims had already secured victories in Iraq and Persia, but Syria was different. The Byzantines had fortified their positions, and their armies were vast and well-equipped. The terrain of Yarmouk was challenging, with the Yarmouk River cutting through the plain, offering both obstacles and opportunities. Khalid ibn al-Walīd, known as the Sword of Allah, was tasked with leading the Muslim forces. His reputation for tactical brilliance preceded him, but even he faced an immense challenge. Khalid's strategy was meticulous. He understood the importance of the high ground and the need to control the river crossings. According to Ibn al-Athir's Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, Khalid divided his forces into three main groups, each with specific objectives. He positioned his men to exploit the terrain, ensuring that the Byzantines could not easily flank or outmaneuver them. The Muslims dug trenches and fortified their positions, preparing for a prolonged engagement. Khalid's intent was to draw the Byzantines into a battle on his terms, where their numerical superiority would be neutralized. However, the Byzantine forces were not idle. They had their own plans and were well aware of the strategic importance of Yarmouk. The Byzantine general, Vahan, was a seasoned commander who had fought against the Persians and knew the art of war. He had gathered a massive army, including reinforcements from his allies, the Armenians and the Ghassanids. The Byzantines sought to encircle the Muslim forces, cutting off their supply lines and forcing them into a desperate last stand. As the two armies faced each other, the tension was palpable. The Muslims, though outnumbered, were united in their faith and their determination to defend Islam. Khalid ibn al-Walīd, ever the strategist, knew that the key to victory lay in maintaining unity and discipline among his troops. He inspired his men with speeches that emphasized their duty to Allah and the Ummah, reminding them of the prophetic tradition that promised reward for those who fought in the path of Allah. The first few days of the battle were marked by skirmishes and probing attacks. The Byzantines tested the Muslim defenses, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Khalid, ever vigilant, adjusted his tactics accordingly. He positioned his cavalry to counter any flanking maneuvers and ensured that his infantry held the fortified positions. The Muslims were ready, but the sheer size of the enemy force was a constant concern. As the battle raged on, the Muslims faced a critical moment. The Byzantines launched a massive assault, aiming to break through the Muslim lines and encircle their forces. According to Al-Tabari, Khalid paused to assess the situation. The scouts reported that the Byzantine forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and the Muslims were at risk of being overwhelmed. Khalid knew that he had to make a decisive move. In a masterful display of tactical genius, Khalid ordered a strategic withdrawal of some of his forces. He created the illusion of a retreat, drawing the Byzantines into a trap. As the Byzantine forces advanced, the Muslims launched a counterattack from the flanks, catching the enemy off guard. The Byzantines, caught in the open, were vulnerable to the Muslim cavalry. The battle turned in favor of the Muslims, and the Byzantines began to falter. The resolution came swiftly. The Byzantine forces, despite their numbers, were unable to withstand the disciplined and coordinated attacks of the Muslims. The high ground and the strategic use of the terrain played a crucial role in the Muslim victory. Khalid's tactics had neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage, and the Byzantines were forced to retreat. The Battle of Yarmouk was a decisive victory for the Muslims, sealing the fate of Syria and paving the way for the expansion of the Islamic State. But the repercussions of this victory were far-reaching. The Byzantine Empire, once a formidable force, was now on the defensive. The Muslims, emboldened by their success, continued their march towards new horizons. What nobody knew was that 200 miles south, a new army was already marching, ready to challenge the Muslims once again. With only 5,000 men at his command, Khalid ibn al-Walīd moved into the road of destiny at Ajnadayn, and what followed became a lesson in how quickly an army can turn by Allah's decree when discipline and patience meet the pressure of numbers. The crisis of the hour was not merely slaughter. It was the fear that the Muslim line might split, that the gains of earlier marches might be swallowed by a larger Byzantine effort gathering in the Levant. What happens when a force that is outnumbered must win before it is fully surrounded? The stakes were immediate. If Ajnadayn went wrong, the Byzantines could tighten control over the approaches to Palestine and cut off movement toward the next defensive necessities. The commanders of the Muslims had to keep their strength coherent, preserve mobility, and prevent the enemy from converting battlefield contact into a strategic collapse. In the Roman-Byzantine world, armies did not simply fight for days' outcomes. They fought to decide routes, supply lines, and the geography of fear. Khalid's presence mattered precisely because his method was not random daring. Even as the armies collided in the region of Ajnadayn, the scholars of history record that he fought with a disciplined eye for timing and for the behavior of troops under pressure. Al-Tabari, in his Chronicle of Events, and Ibn al-Athir, in al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, describe the campaign movements around the Syrian front and the repeated need to meet Byzantine forces before they could consolidate fully. In that environment, Ajnadayn was not an isolated brawl. It was one hinge in a chain that would lead later to the great stand at Yarmouk. The geography of the moment was harsh in its simplicity. Ajnadayn lay in the land routes of Palestine, where roads and fields determined the flow of cavalry and the capacity of infantry to hold. In such terrain, a commander's most important work is not only to charge, it is to decide where the enemy's momentum will break. Ibn Kathir, in al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, situates the Levant campaigns in a sequence of clashes in which Muslim leadership repeatedly sought to prevent the Byzantines from gaining a clean, unified front. As for the numbers, the historical record preserves the fact that Khalid commanded 5,000 men in this turning point action at Ajnadayn. While later accounts vary in how they detail every subgroup and exact headcount, the consistent core preserved by our classical historians is that Khalid's force was far smaller than what the Byzantines could bring to the field. Ibn al-Athir notes the broader patterns of engagement in the campaign and the urgency of meeting the enemy where they attempted to act decisively. Al-Tabari likewise records the flow of conflict in the region in a way that reflects how quickly advantage could be gained or lost by, whether a smaller Muslim formation could strike at the right moment rather than be pinned. Khalid's tactical reasoning, as can be understood from the historical descriptions, was rooted in control of contact. He did not aim for an endless contest of attrition against a numerically superior enemy. He aimed to create a decisive disturbance in how the enemy formed and advanced, then to convert that disturbance into a rout that could be exploited before the Byzantines recovered. In the language of commanders, This meant attacking at a point where the enemy would struggle to coordinate, forcing the enemy to fight under imperfect cohesion. In the Islamic perspective preserved by our Sunni historians, the hero's decision is never separated from his reliance on Allah and his restraint. Al-Dhahabi, when discussing the lives and deeds of the great commanders and the moral fabric of the early conquests, emphasizes how the Umar's leadership was characterized by courage joined to accountability, not merely audacity. Ibn Khaldun, in al-Muqaddimah, offers a lens for why disciplined groups can overcome larger ones. When authority, cohesion, and morale are strong, the degree of solidarity can reshape the outcome of battle. That principle does not replace the historical narrative. It helps explain how the recorded battlefield outcomes could become possible. But even a plan built on clarity can meet the wall of reality. In the crisis of Ajnadayn, Khalid faced the hardest kind of doubt, whether his smaller force could strike hard enough, fast enough, before the Byzantines fully organized. When a command is outnumbered, every delay can become fatal. According to al-Tabari's account of the campaign rhythm, and as Ibn al-Athir follows by tracing how engagements in the Levant unfolded in rapid succession, the enemy's advantage could arrive simply through time. The time needed to bring weight to the front, coordinate cavalry, and press the Muslims into a position where they must defend rather than choose. Khalid's moment of difficulty was therefore not only on the battlefield, it was in decision-making under pressure. The scouts and messengers would bring partial knowledge, and partial knowledge in war is dangerous. Ibn al-Athir records how commanders in these campaigns relied on movement and on information arriving at critical moments, sometimes arriving fast, sometimes arriving late. In such circumstances, the human side of command emerges. The commander must accept risk because waiting can be its own disaster. Then came the payoff of strategy. When Khalid committed to the decisive thrust at Ajnadayn, the historical narratives indicate that he succeeded in disrupting the Byzantine momentum. The result was not only local advantage. It was psychological and structural. A force that expects to press forward finds itself instead forced to correct formation, adjust lines, and fight a battle where they cannot fully impose their rhythm. Ibn Kathir, in al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, places Ajnadayn within the wider arc of clashes in the Levant that repeatedly demonstrated Muslim tactical ability in situations where they were not guaranteed numerical superiority. Al-Tabari's chronicle likewise conveys the impression of a. With 20,000 victorious Muslim warriors standing amidst the ruins of the Byzantine army's defeat at Yarmouk, a new crisis emerged. The day after the battle, Abu ʿUbayda ibn al-Jarrah, the commander of the Muslim forces, faced a dilemma that would test the very foundations of their newly established victory. The Byzantines, though defeated, were not yet broken. Their remnants fled to the fortified cities of Syria, regrouping under the command of Emperor Heraclius himself, who was now marshalling every available force for a final stand. As al-Tabari recorded in his Tarikh al-Rusul wa al-Muluk, the Muslim army, though triumphant, was now divided. The immediate question was whether to pursue the fleeing Byzantine forces or to consolidate their gains. The stakes were immense. If the Muslims hesitated, the Byzantines might regroup, rally their allies, and launch a counteroffensive that could reverse the hard-won victory. If they pushed forward without proper planning, they risked overextending their forces and falling into strategic traps set by the experienced Byzantine generals. The Muslim army, fresh from their victory at Yarmouk, numbered around 20,000 men. However, the Byzantines, though defeated, still had significant forces stationed in the fortified cities of Syria, including Damascus and Emesa. According to Ibn al-Athir in al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, Emperor Heraclius was gathering reinforcements from as far away as Anatolia and Egypt, aiming to assemble an army of at least 50,000 men to retake Syria. The Muslims, though formidable, were vastly outnumbered if they were to engage the Byzantines in a direct assault on their fortified strongholds. Abu ʿUbayda, known for his wisdom and prudence, recognized the strategic challenges ahead. He understood that the key to sustaining their victory lay not just in military prowess, but in sound judgment and divine guidance. He consulted with his senior commanders, including Khalid ibn al-Walīd and Amr ibn al-As, both of whom had proven their tactical brilliance on the battlefield. The debate was intense. Some advocated for an immediate march on Damascus, arguing that the Byzantines were demoralized and could be swiftly defeated before they regrouped. Others, led by Abu ʿUbayda, favored a more cautious approach, emphasizing the need to secure their supply lines and consolidate their control over the territories they had already conquered. The crisis deepened when reports arrived that the Byzantine forces in Damascus, under the command of General Thomas, were fortifying the city and preparing for a siege. The Muslims, with their limited resources and the vast distances they had covered, faced the real possibility of being stretched too thin. Abu ʍubaydah, ever the strategist, knew that a hasty attack on Damascus could lead to a prolonged and costly siege, draining their resources and potentially giving the Byzantines the time they needed to rally their forces. According to Ibn Kathir in al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, Abu ʍubaydah sent a letter to Caliph ʿUmar ibn al-Khattab in Medina, detailing the situation and seeking guidance. The letter, written with the utmost respect and humility, outlined the strategic challenges and the options available to the Muslim commanders. Abu ʍubaydah's decision to write to Umar was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to his reliance on divine guidance and the collective wisdom of the Muslim leadership. He understood that the success of the Muslim army was not just a matter of military strategy, but of adhering to the principles of justice, consultation, and reliance on Allah. The letter reached Umar, who was already aware of the magnitude of the victory at Yarmouk. He recognized the critical nature of the situation and the need for a decisive, yet cautious approach. Umar's response, as recorded by Al-Tabari, was a masterclass in leadership. He acknowledged the bravery and tactical brilliance of the Muslim commanders, but emphasized the importance of patience and strategic foresight. He advised Abu ʍubaydah to secure the newly conquered territories, ensure the loyalty of the local populations, and only then consider launching an offensive against Damascus. The resolution came in the form of a carefully crafted plan. The Muslim army was to split into two divisions. One division, led by Khalid ibn al-Walīd, was to march towards Emesa, a key Byzantine stronghold, to prevent the Byzantines from regrouping and launching a counteroffensive from the north. The other division, under the command of Abu ʍubaydah and Amr ibn al-As, would advance towards Damascus, but not before securing their supply lines and ensuring that the local Arab tribes remained loyal to the Muslim cause. The tactical reasoning behind this division was clear. By targeting Emesa, Khalid would cut off the Byzantines' northern supply routes and prevent them from receiving reinforcements from Anatolia. This would force the Byzantines in Damascus to fight on two fronts, weakening their overall position. Meanwhile, the advance on Damascus would be conducted with caution, ensuring that the Muslims were not drawn into a prolonged and resource-draining siege. The plan worked. As Ibn al-Athir noted, the Byzantines, faced with the prospect of fighting on two fronts, were forced to divide their own forces. This division weakened their overall position and made it easier for the Muslims to engage them in battle. The Muslims' victory at Yarmouk was not just a single battle, but the beginning of a broader strategic campaign to secure Syria and lay the foundations for the spread of Islam. However, the crisis was not yet over. As the Muslim forces prepared to advance on Damascus, a new threat emerged. Reports arrived that Emperor Heraclius himself was leading a massive army from Antioch, intent on retaking Syria and crushing the Muslim forces once and for all. The news sent shockwaves through the Muslim ranks, as they realized that the final battle for Syria was yet to come. With the siege tightening around Damascus, only one fact mattered to the commanders in the field. The city's gates could be opened only if the Byzantine troops inside were forced to spend their strength on fighting on the outside. Al-Tabari, narrating the events that followed the battle's climax, shows how the Muslim army moved from open battlefield pressure to the harder work of breaking relief and control around Damascus. Because if the Pact did not hold under strain, the whole momentum would collapse back into a mere war of attrition. Ibn al-Athir, recording the same sequence of events in al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, emphasizes that it was not enough to be brave. It was necessary to be coordinated, steady, and disciplined when the ground itself seemed to turn against decision-makers. What was at stake was not only a wall of stone. Damascus was a hinge city. Its survival meant Byzantine authority could reassert itself through the Levant. Its fall would mean the Caliphate's authority in the region could no longer be treated as a temporary incursion. If the Muslims failed to translate victory in the field into leverage around the city, then the surrounding provinces would become a battlefield of raids rather than a conquest that secured stable governance. As the pressure mounted toward Damascus, the question became, how does an army that has already fought fiercely keep an advantage long enough to compel the enemy to negotiate? Ibn Kathir, in al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, places emphasis on how the Muslim commanders understood that a city is not taken by courage alone. It is taken by controlling the conditions around it, preventing effective relief, maintaining the morale of troops, and ensuring that any negotiations or sudden breakdowns in enemy would occur on terms favorable to Islam. The geographic reality of the Levant made this especially urgent. Damascus was not isolated. It stood as a center that connected roads, routes of movement, and the ability of Byzantine forces to gather and reassemble. If the Muslims could not maintain a functional perimeter and keep Byzantine command from turning regrouping into reinforcements, then the city would remain too powerful to approach with confidence. This is where the 12,000-soldier Pact enters the narrative arc of the episode. Al-Tabari reports, in the unfolding account of the Levant's campaigns, that a defined body of fighters was deployed in a manner that kept the siege pressure effective, while other elements maintained broader security and movement. Ibn al-Athir similarly records the structured manner of deployment, showing that Muslim forces were divided not to weaken them, but to make their pressure continuous. This is the kind of strategy that reveals a deeper meaning of tawakkul, trusting Allah while also using the means that Allah places within human capability. The Muslims were not passive. They chose, arranged, and held. The strategic reasoning was straightforward in its core and demanding in its execution. The Byzantine army, although forced to withdraw in earlier fighting, could still regroup under capable leadership. If that regrouping reached the roads leading toward Damascus, the siege would become a trapped position rather than a lever. Therefore, the Muslim commanders emphasized maintaining a reliable force that could anchor the perimeter while preventing an effective relief column from reaching the city. Ibn Khaldun, in al-Muqaddimah, while not writing the campaign as a battlefield diary, provides a principle that fits the logic of these deployments. Victories are sustained by order, cohesion, and the ability to keep fighting strength aligned with a plan rather than scattered by momentary emotion. His historical theory is not mere abstraction. It becomes visible in the way the Levant campaign is described by earlier chroniclers. Disciplined units operating with clear intent, rather than a mass of warriors moving without coordination. But as the siege of Damascus pressed into the 10th stage, doubt and strain were never absent. A commander can plan correctly and still face the fear that the plan will fail under pressure. Al-Tabari's narrations show the psychological weight carried by commanders who knew that Byzantines could exploit any lapse, especially any gap in the continuity of pressure. Ibn al-Athir records that the enemy's ability to regroup meant that time itself became a battlefield. Every delay could allow the Byzantines to turn hardship into opportunity. So what happened when the Pact was tested? The answer lies in the way the Muslims handled the city as an evolving problem, not a single fixed moment. Rather than assuming that the Byzantines would simply weaken, the Muslim leadership maintained readiness for multiple outcomes: attack, negotiation, and sudden shifts in enemy intention. This is consistent with what Ibn Kathir narrates regarding Muslim conduct in the Levant. The strength of the Muslims was not only their sword, but their preparation for what might come next. At the center of this stage stood the concept of reliable leadership among the Ansar of the early conquests, commanders who understood that unity prevents panic. When the historians describe the deployment around Damascus, they highlight not chaos, but controlled pressure. That controlled pressure was designed to deny the Byzantines the chance to convert their survival into renewed dominance. In other words, the goal was to force the Byzantines to consider whether further fighting would yield anything beyond exhaustion. The crisis in this chapter is therefore not a single dramatic charge already covered in the earlier episode's battlefield focus. Here, the crisis is operational and moral. The fear that men who have fought hard will become vulnerable if the siege pressure relaxes, and that a city's defenders will find a moment to break the Muslims. Coordination. Al-Tabari's narrative emphasis on careful sequencing implies that commanders were constantly balancing two realities: the necessity of maintaining pressure and the risk that prolonged strain could fracture the unity of the army. Even confidence had to be disciplined. Ibn al-Athir's style often brings out how a commander's decisions were tied to reports from the field and the enemy's movements. When the Byzantine regrouping and relief potential were still plausible, the Muslims could not afford to scatter into isolated actions. So the strategic reasoning behind the 12,000-soldier pact becomes clear. It was an anchor. A disciplined, committed force could absorb shock and prevent the perimeter from collapsing, while other parts of the army managed the wider strategic environment. Resolution came not as a sudden miracle, but as a conversion of pressure into control. As Ibn Kathir narrates, the Muslim advance in the Levant aimed at securing conditions that would lead cities to either open the way for Muslim governance or face a sustained inability to rely on outside help. The siege around Damascus thus became a mechanism. It compelled the defenders to evaluate their situation in light of the Muslims, maintained strength and coordination. In this stage, the Muslims' adherence to justice and disciplined conduct also mattered. The Sunni historical tradition does not separate victory from ethics. The chronicles emphasize that Muslim commanders approached outcomes with a sense of order. If negotiation was the path that prevented unnecessary bloodshed, then it was a course consistent with Islam's restraint and discipline. That is why the siege pressure is described as sustained and purposeful, rather than chaotic and destructive. Even when armed force was used, the aim remained submission to Allah through lawful authority and the establishment of order. The strategic payoff, therefore, was twofold. First, the Muslims prevented the Byzantines from turning survival into effective reinforcement. Second, the maintained pressure around Damascus, supported by a pact-like cohesion of a defined fighting body, created the conditions under which the defenders could no longer treat resistance as cost-free. Al-Tabari reports the development of these stages in the broader campaign narrative, and Ibn al-Athir's record reinforces that the shift from battlefield advantage to siege leverage was achieved through structured deployment rather than mere momentum. But the chapter closes with an open loop, because campaigns do not end at the first turn. The looming question was this: once Damascus began to feel the weight of sustained pressure, would the Byzantines attempt a final, desperate relief effort, or would they decide that negotiation was the only way to preserve what remained? Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir both, in their ways, leave the narrative poised on the boundary between siege pressure and enemy decision. What the Muslims could not fully know, what the enemy might exploit if given the smallest window, was the possibility of a new maneuver elsewhere that could change the balance before the city fully yielded. The historians show that even after decisive moments, the contest remained alive in the minds of commanders. The struggle was not only against walls, but against uncertainty, logistics, and the enemy's capacity to respond. And that means the Damascus story is still building toward a decisive next development, one that would test whether the pact of 12,000 men, the discipline of deployment, and the steadfastness under tawakkul would translate into final control, or whether a new threat would rise faster than any negotiation could settle. With only 6,000 Muslim warriors against 60,000 Byzantine forces in Homs, Khalid ibn al-Walīd had to act swiftly. The fate of Syria hung in the balance. The strategic challenge was immense. The Byzantines, regrouped and reinforced under Emperor Heraclius, had massed their forces in Homs, determined to break the Muslim momentum. The Muslims, though fewer in number, had the advantage of morale and divine favor. As Ibn al-Athir recorded in Al-Kamil fi al-Tarikh, Khalid understood that a direct confrontation would be suicidal. He needed to split the Byzantine forces, weaken them, and then strike. Homs was a fortified city, and the surrounding terrain was favorable for defensive tactics. The Byzantines had chosen their ground well, intending to wear down the Muslims with superior numbers and supplies. Khalid's tactical reasoning was clear. He needed to create a diversion, draw out a portion of the Byzantine army, and then engage them in a decisive battle. He chose to march toward Emesa, a city to the north of Homs. As Al-Tabari recorded in Tarikh al-Rusul wa al-Muluk, Khalid's movement toward Emesa forced the Byzantines to split their forces. A significant contingent, numbering around 20,000, broke off from the main Byzantine army and marched toward Emesa to protect it. This left the remainder of the Byzantine forces in Homs vulnerable. The Muslims, now facing a smaller force, could engage them more effectively. The crisis came when Khalid realized that the Byzantines in Homs were not idle. They had sent scouts and spies to track Muslim movements. According to Al-Tabari, Khalid paused. The scouts reported that the Byzantines were aware of his strategy and were preparing an ambush. Khalid had to decide. Should he continue toward Emesa and risk being caught in a pincer movement, or should he retreat and lose the initiative? Khalid's solution was characteristic of his genius. He sent a portion of his forces to engage the Byzantines in Homs, while he himself led the main body of the army toward Emesa. The Byzantine forces in Homs, seeing the smaller Muslim force, advanced to engage them. This allowed Khalid to reach Emesa virtually unopposed. The Byzantines in Emesa, realizing their mistake, hastily retreated toward Homs. The strategic payoff was immediate. The Byzantines, now divided and disorganized, were no match for the focused Muslim attack. Khalid's forces, reinforced by those who had engaged the Byzantines in Homs, launched a coordinated assault. The Byzantines, caught between two Muslim forces, were forced to retreat. The battle for Emesa was won, and the way to Homs was open. But the victory was not without cost. Khalid ibn al-Walīd, the Sword of Allah, was wounded in the fighting. His condition was serious, and the Muslims were left without their greatest commander at a critical moment. As Ibn Kathir noted in al-Bidaya wa al-Nihaya, the Muslims were faced with a new challenge. Who would take the standard after Khalid? With only 3 days of absolute disorder after the Persian capital's panic began, Ctesiphon's fate did not turn on walls or gates, but on a decision made in motion, as Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir both describe. The moment when the Caliph's riding party could no longer ignore what was happening far from the palaces, and the leadership had to act as if the city itself had become a battlefield. How does an empire break when the enemy is not simply at the gates, but is already shaping the rhythm of your every command? And why would a commander's fear not of death, but of delay drive him to one of the most decisive leadership actions of this age? Al-Tabari reports that after the pressures around the former imperial centers and the collapse of confidence that followed earlier engagements, many districts began to move with the logic of survival rather than discipline. Ibn al-Athir likewise records that the gathering of forces, especially where rival interests competed, did not always produce unity, but produced delay, and delay produced openings. In that atmosphere, leadership had to do something uncomfortable. It had to ride against uncertainty. The stakes were stark. If the Muslims lost their ability to strike with purpose, if their arrangement of forces became just another reaction to enemy confusion, then the gains that had been bought with patience would slip away. Siege work, field coordination, and the ability to sustain morale were all at risk. And for the people of the Muslim advance, there was a deeper danger. When command becomes hesitant, intention becomes unstable. True leadership in our tradition is tested not only by swordcraft, but by steadiness under Allah's command. So historians emphasize how decisions were bound to resolve, not to panic. In the Arabic and Muslim world, these days were spoken of not as mere campaign hours, but as a leadership crisis. Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir narrate that the caliphal leadership guided by the counsel of those close to authority sought speed, not haste, order, not uncontrolled pursuit. They were not chasing spectacle. They were chasing the removal of ambiguity from the battlefield. That is why the movement of the Caliph is not presented as personal drama. Ibn Kathir, drawing from earlier historians, frames such moments as the responsibility of the ruler to ensure that the Ummah does not become separated into islands of initiative. Al-Dhahabi, in summarizing the biographies and turning points of the righteous commanders and the era's leadership, treats the caliphal stance as part of a moral pattern. Those who carry power must not abandon the community to its worst fears. So the story continues toward the breakdown at Ctesiphon with an image our historians want us to see clearly. The imperial center was no longer a single mind. It was many voices, many clerks, many messengers, many local leaders, and each of them acted under incomplete knowledge. Al-Tabari records how, when the pressure of war reaches a capital's nerves, the first casualty is not steel, it is coordination. Ibn al-Athir similarly emphasizes that the enemy's arrangements shifted repeatedly, as reports and counter-reports multiplied, until the chain of command did not move as one. Against this, the Muslim side carried a disciplined advantage. Their operations were tied to clear objectives: contain, pressure, compel a decision rather than merely to reach. In earlier portions of the saga, the Muslims had learned that consistent pressure around key areas could force the enemy into choosing between unacceptable options. Now that same lesson returns with a harsher edge. If the Persian leadership fragmented, then the Muslim advance could press at the moments when fragmentation was most visible. The rising tension is described as a contest over time. Al-Tabari notes that when the leadership in the capital could not secure a stable plan, the enemy began to shuffle authority between commanders and districts, trying to patch holes faster than the battlefield could widen them. Ibn al-Athir gives the sense of a machinery that keeps turning, but not toward the same goal, each wheel turning as if it were alone. Ibn Kathir, summarizing, stresses that the enemy's confidence was shaken in a way that could not easily be reversed by decrees. In such a setting, what matters most is the method used to exploit confusion. The Muslim commanders were not described as relying on mere luck. They were described as relying on sound judgment, using intelligence, and maintaining readiness for immediate action. Al-Tabari reports the constant attention to reports of movement, and Ibn al-Athir explains how scouts and messengers functioned as the bloodstream of command. The Muslim logic was simple in principle. Do not march blind into a maze of conflicting enemy intentions. Strike with the knowledge you have, and be prepared to adjust when new knowledge arrives. But now the humans inside the story had to face the cost of adjustment. Because Ctesiphon was not a village you can surround and forget. It was a political and symbolic center. And as Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir depict, the very attempt to hold such a center together under war pressure required constant decisions made while letters arrived late, while messengers were blocked, while local authorities acted on rumors. This is where the crisis of doubt arrives. Historians do not hide the weight of uncertainty. Ibn al-Athir, in his careful chronology, indicates that at certain points the enemy's actions were erratic because leaders were trying to cover multiple threats at once: internal disorder on one side, military pressure on the other. Al-Tabari similarly presents periods where the direction of the conflict did not look cleanly linear. And in that gap, the Muslim leadership had to do what is hardest: maintain patience while anticipating sudden opportunity. So how did they choose? The resolution was not a single dramatic charge. It was the choice to concentrate decisive effort when the enemy's chain of command showed its weakest moment. Al-Tabari reports that the leadership sought the alignment of forces at points where enemy coordination was already failing. Ibn al-Athir notes the practical reality. When an opposing center is seized by panic and administrative confusion, the battlefield becomes a map of local decisions rather than a single theater plan. That is where the Muslim advantage becomes tangible. The Muslims could then pressure, compel movement, and deny the enemy the luxury of regrouping into coherent resistance. The same spirit that had guided earlier siege pressure and deployment-careful coordination rather than reckless pursuit now turns into a leadership method: act when the opponent's decision-making is already unstable. As the days continue, the documentary's payoff is the moral one as well as the tactical one. Historians highlight that steadfastness and reliance on Allah are not slogans, they are behaviors. Ibn Kathir emphasizes that decisive action from the leadership was paired with consultation, and that the faithful did not treat victory as a matter of individual brilliance alone. Al-Dhahabi's biographical approach reinforces the principle. The era's greatness is described through character: how the people of authority and the commanders acted with integrity, discipline, and accountability. And so the story reaches a cliffhanger that our historians, in their chronologies, keep reminding us about. The breakdown at a capital is never the end of war. It is an opening. The empire does not stop moving because one center hesitates. Other regions can still mobilize, and other plans can still be formed away from the shattered command posts. That is why the moment after this panic is not described as triumphal closure. Al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir both proceed through the next steps of the campaign narrative with attention to the continued movement of forces and the possibility that a new concentration of power could still appear, even if the old capital's confidence has already fractured. So the unresolved question hangs in the air, and it must. If Ctesiphon's command could fracture under pressure, what would happen when the enemy attempted to replace that lost unity with a new army, one that learns from the failure of the capital, one that is organized somewhere else? The Caliph's ride, the leadership's urgency, the capital's 3 days of disorder, these were the turning key. But the door they opened might lead to a larger chamber of war. And the next chamber, as the chronicles warn by their very structure, always begins with the enemy gathering itself somewhere the Muslims do not expect.